Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead. And today we're going to be doing things with baking powder. And this goes very much to self-reliance, food security, and emergency preparedness. And so the title of this video is Making and Storing Baking Powder. But we cannot talk about baking powder without talking about baking soda, bicarbonate of soda. And so I have some things set up here so that you can see what we're going to be talking about today. So here's our baking powder and here's our soda. Now we did a why store baking soda video several months ago, and it was very well received. And we talked about all the many different dozens and dozens of different uses for baking soda and why it is so important to store it in larger quantities. Now, today we're going to talk about baking powder in particular, but it includes a discussion on soda as well. So both of these are leavening agents used normally for quick breads without yeast, breads that we mix up the batter and then we stick the batter in the oven pretty much right away. So let's talk about the difference of what happens to our dough when we use soda compared to when we use baking powder. So first of all, I'm just going to put a teaspoon of soda in this little bowl, wiping it off with a dish towel, and a teaspoon of baking powder in this little bowl. And a little bit of water in each one. Stirring it around. And stirring it around. And now we are going to do the litmus paper test so that you can see for yourself the chemical composition of these two compounds. So first of all, we will do soda, bicarbonate of soda. It is quite green. It is a 9 on the pH scale. That puts it in the alkaline territory. And now for baking powder. It is greenish. It is a 7, which is neutral. So it is right between the acid end of things and the alkaline end of things. It is right at a 7. And so that's important for us to know. When we add baking soda to a recipe as the only leavening agent, we will always see an acid because this is alkaline. And in order for it to produce the carbon dioxide, which is the leavening gas that works inside the dough to lift up the dough, like in cakes or whatever it is that we might be baking, the leavening agent must produce that gas, carbon dioxide, in order to lift the dough and make it light and airy. In order to activate baking soda, we need to use vinegar. So let's test that and see what happens. All right, starting over with a teaspoon of soda here. And a teaspoon of baking powder here. Let's add, this is alkaline, let's add an acid. And this is just apple cider vinegar. And you all already know what's going to happen. If you have children, you've made volcanoes using this combination. I've judged a zillion science fairs, and there's always at least one baking soda and vinegar volcano in science fairs these days. So when the baking soda hits that acid, it creates that gas that leavens the dough. So what about baking powder? Would acid also activate the baking powder? Well, let's see. So yes, there is a little bit of activation, a little bit of foaming and bubbling on the part of the baking powder as well. So what does that tell us about the baking powder? Even though its pH is neutral, just like water, it has some alkaline in it, because otherwise it wouldn't foam up like that and react with the acid. So we know that baking powder has alkaline in it. It also has acid in it. And so how is baking powder activated in dough? Sometimes you might find acid in a baking powder recipe, but if so, it's only activating the alkaline part of the baking powder and not the other part, unless there are two other things which generally occur whenever we make dough. Baking powder is activated by heat and water. And so this baking powder contains an acid and an alkaline together. And so one of the ways that we tell if our baking soda is still good is to use the baking soda and vinegar test. And we've just seen that. So this baking soda is still very active. And we know that the alkaline part of the baking powder is also very active. But let's just check the baking powder overall so we can test out the whole thing and not just the alkaline part. So let me rinse these bowls and I'll be right back. So our next little test right here is going to be testing both of them with hot water. So I'm going to get hot water in this cup. Pour about half in this bowl and half in this bowl. And now, first of all, we're going to test the baking soda, and Jim is going to get really close to see if heat or moisture activates the baking soda. Nope, it's deader than a doornail there. And so activation of soda depends on an acid because it is alkaline. All right, now what about baking powder? If the baking powder is activated by heat and liquid, let's see what happens. Watch the edges of the baking powder. So there we have a really good indication that this baking powder is still active and still good, still usable in my recipes because we can see that it is still active. All right, so now what does this mean in terms of our baking? So what it means is that we need to have the additional ingredients in our recipes to activate either the soda or the baking powder. And there are also storage implications here. Because moisture does not affect soda, this is how we store our bulk soda long term in its original packaging. Now, this has been opened, but we have some more out in these big containers that has not been opened, and it will be good out there for years and years and years and years. And so will this, even though it has been opened, because it is very stable. And so it is good to store for lots and lots of other reasons. And today we're going to add another reason why it is really good to store baking soda. So let's talk just about baking powder for a minute in terms of storage. If we purchase baking powder in bulk, and this is in bulk for me, because this would last me a couple of years. And actually the best used by date on this is December 7th of this year. So this should still be good, but I'm not going to open this yet because I have others that are much older. This one is 2017. This one is 2019. or maybe the other way around. This is 2017, this is 2019. And so this is the one that I have opened. But so long as it is stored in original packaging, which is pretty airtight, it is going to be safe from moisture. Moisture is the big enemy of baking powder. And so this is how we have stored this on our shelves, and we've had this out there already about 4 years. And so it is shelf stable in this container for about 4 years. Once we open it, then it is good for only about 6 months to 12 months. Now, the way that we test that is exactly what we did with this one. Put a teaspoon in a half a cup of hot water. If it bubbles around the edges, it is still active. If it isn't, this needs to go in the trash. We need to open a new one. And so you can also, once this is opened, I won't go through this. It will take me 2 years to go through this much baking powder. And so this is way too much to just keep out there on my shelf. I won't be able to use it in 6 months. And so the other thing to do is to immediately put it into either a canning jar with a tight lid. Don't vacuum seal it. Just put it in an airtight container and tighten down the lid, or store it in Mylar bags. Seal it up in a Mylar bag. But all of the literature that I read on this said do not vacuum seal. So it's just best in an airtight container. It doesn't have to be without air, just airtight. It has to be, we are protecting it from moisture. And so that's the reason why we want to keep air out of it, because air contains moisture. So if you are going to repackage this, do it on a day that is not humid. Now also, what about a desiccant? You can use a desiccant with baking powder, but this is like trying to get the horses back in the barn after they've escaped, because a desiccant removes moisture that is already there. So the ideal situation is to open this up and immediately put it into a Mylar and seal it up so no moisture gets to it, and you don't have to use a desiccant that way. So once it is opened, it will last 6 to 12 months. That would be this one, because I have the lid off and on this several times a week. But anything that I have left over, I would put in a canning jar with a lid or seal it in Mylar. All right, so what if by some chance I completely am out of baking powder? Now, in our last video, I really complimented our learning community, because I stated that we learn so much from our community. It is a wonderful exchange of information. And so it is worth your while to read the comments under videos, because there's lots of learning that is there. And there are sometimes comments under the comments under the comments. And Jim does most of our responding. I do some responding. Sometimes he'll come and say, can you answer this one? And so I will. And that is mainly because I'm working really hard on trying to meet my publication deadline for the bread book that I've been working on. But I'll get back to answering again once that is published, because I'm going to take a break from writing books for a little while. So in any case, one of the things that we picked up from one of the comments was, and I had planned on doing this video on baking powder for quite a while, but this person said, instead of storing baking powder, why don't you store the ingredients for making baking powder? And so that sent me on another research line, and I had a lot of fun reading about that. And it is true. We can make baking powder. We know that it is an acid and an alkaline. Well, if we knew what those were, we could mix those together in the right proportions and make our own baking powder. Well, we do know what those are. So I have organized right here the 3 ingredients that are needed to make baking powder. And look how simple this is. Bicarbonate of soda, this is cream of tartar, and this is cornstarch. And cornstarch is optional, and I'll get to that in just a minute. So we have an alkaline. We know baking powder has an alkaline and an acid in it. So this is the alkaline part. This is the acid part. Cream of tartar is acid? Well, I think we better check that out. So let's just get a little spoonful of this cream of tartar in the bottom of this bowl and add a little bit of water. And let's do a litmus check. Oh, look at that. Not up here in the alkaline section, not in the neutral section, definitely acid. It's about a 3. So it is an acid. So that makes a lot of sense then to add cream of tartar and baking soda together. And people have figured out what the proportions are, and it is very, very easy. It is 2 parts of cream of tartar, 1 part of baking soda. And if you are going to mix up only the amount that you need for a given recipe, this is all you need. If, on the other hand, you are going to mix up extra and keep in your cabinet, then you will want to add a little bit of cornstarch. Cornstarch prevents the two from interacting with each other and prevents clumping. Commercial baking powder has a starch or a compound in it to do that very thing. Now, you will notice that on commercial baking powder, it says double acting. Now, what that means is that it has not just 1 acid in it, but 2 acids. And we don't put a second acid in the baking powder that we're going to make, only just cream of tartar. That second acid is a longer acting acid, in case you need to let your dough sit for a while. Now remember, it's already wet, it's going to be heated in the oven, and so the first blush of that acid may be activated and not as powerful if you let your dough sit. So when we make homemade baking powder, we just need to remember it's not double acting, it's single acting. It only has a single acid, so we need to mix our dough and get it in the oven fairly quickly. All right, so 2 parts, 1 part, 1 part, 2, 1, 1. So here is a little sign to help you remember that it's 2 parts to 1 part to 1 part. So that is 2 parts cream of tartar, 1 part baking soda, 1 part cornstarch, but that's optional. Use the cornstarch only if it's going to sit on your shelf for a while. So let's mix up a little bit, and I'm just going to do it by teaspoon. So 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, 1 teaspoon of soda, and I have it in this airtight jar that is a little Weck jar that I'm going to clip down, and it has that nice gasket on it, so it will keep it airtight and free from moisture. And then I'm just going to mix them together. And so here is enough baking powder, 3 teaspoons of baking powder that I can use in a recipe today. If I'm not going to use it today, then I would add 1 teaspoon of cornstarch to keep them from clumping up. And it really is a nicer mixture in there now. And you would use the same amount in your recipe, whether the cornstarch is in or out. It will work just the very same. So let's talk about implications, and then we'll wind up this video. First of all, if you are going to buy commercial baking powder, buy it in small containers, not the large containers. Once I thought through this, we stacked the rest of our storage baking powder in sizes like this. so that it would not go bad once I opened. So buy small containers of regular commercial baking powder. Store in the original containers as long as possible. Once it is opened, keep it in an airtight environment, whether that is a canning jar or an airtight jar like this, or Mylar, whatever, but don't vacuum seal it and don't use a desiccant. Or you can add these 3 ingredients in bulk to your food storage ingredients so that you can make all the baking powder you would like on demand. And so there we have how to make and store baking powder. I hope you find this useful and that you will enjoy making up some of your own baking powder. Thank you so much for being with us. We look forward to your comments, and we will see you at our next video.